watching Veracity Hill. Here is your host, Dr. J.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on wrong on the resurrection. Maybe there's a question, maybe there's a comment. It's just a comment. We'll find out. Today's episode, I'll be diving into Chapter 4 of Bart Ehrman's book. It's part of a series I've been doing this autumn. How Jesus Became God, the Exaltation of a Jewish Preacher from Galilee. And I've been meticulously going into Bart's book, and we continue our survey of this material. So, before we do that, though, I want to share with you some thoughts and reflections on ETS, and which is an annual conference of theologians and philosophers. And I was in Boston a couple weeks ago, and just really had a great time. It's an opportunity to see friends once a year, and my friends, my comrades in apologetics ministry, scholars that are reading papers. While the papers are really the feature of the event, the people have the most fun by just getting a meal with their buddy and catching up, seeing how their year went, so on and so forth. So it's a great time, and every year I try to go. And next year it's in Denver. And so if you are wanting to learn more, you can go to, I think the site's etsjets.org for the ETS, Evangelical Theological Society. They're the ones that put it on. The EPS, the Philosophical Society, has 3 different sections as part of that larger conference. I'm also a member of the EPS, and my organization, Defenders Media, has been doing some client work for the EPS, doing some website work and some customer service. We're setting up an online store for them. So, yes, it's been a pleasure to be helping them out as well in that capacity. The end of the year is coming up, and if you are considering making a year-end contribution, I would very much welcome your support here at Veracity Hill. If you've enjoyed the various resources that we've been creating and producing week after week, please consider becoming a partner with me. You can go to veracityhill.com/donate and make a one-time contribution, or you can start a monthly partnership. I'd be honored to receive your support, even if it's just $25 a month, to help this program become sustainable in the long run. Thank you for considering your support of our program. All right, well, let me talk about this chapter. Chapter 4, the resurrection of Jesus, what we cannot know. Bart thinks that evangelicals are wrong, and very much wrong. And there's so much I have to say. I'm absolutely positive I will not be able to get through the entirety of this chapter on today's episode. But nevertheless, I will do what I can to work my way through. Certainly, I'll try my best to work through his methodology. It's clear that Bart has a process here in each chapter. He gives a method, and then he kind of applies that. He finds a way of applying the content that he wants to deal with to the method that he has constructed. So we will be dealing with philosophical claims, philosophical arguments in some cases that Bart makes on today's program. So I will do my best to work the camera appropriately, but let me make sure I have a few slides to work through. Socials. If you don't yet subscribe to Veracity Hill on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter X. We also have a TikTok channel that I have nothing to do with. Thank you, Gabe, and anybody else at Defenders that works that. Then also at apologetics315.com, we have a Veracity Hill channel. You can subscribe to that as well. So please be sure to follow me on whatever platform you're listening on. And if you are a podcaster, write a review. If you've enjoyed listening to me work through this material in Bart's book, getting deep into the weeds, because, well, you might not have the time to do that, but you enjoy listening every now and again to this program, consider writing a review on whatever podcast app you're using. Veracity Hill Book Club. Hey, this is a fun little thing that I do just roughly 2 times a month. I work through a book I wouldn't otherwise normally read because of various work obligations. And so right now we are reading through 5 perspectives on Paul. So new perspective on Paul, traditional Protestant, traditional Roman Catholic view, and a couple other, I think they're called like post new perspectives on Paul, which is weird. That's a new thing for me. 'Cause, see, I didn't know about it. And that's one of the reasons why I have the book club, is so I do that, but I enjoy the conversations with those reading alongside with me as well. There is a virtual option. You do not have to live in the western suburbs of Chicago, but if you do, I would welcome you to come to our office, where we do have some people that come into our larger space, which is behind me here, behind this wall. We've got a larger meeting room. But there's a virtual option. It's just a Google Meet link. And we have someone from Australia that actually joins us. And it's the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of each month. So we'd be happy to have you join. Go to the website to learn more about that. All right, let's get into it. Wrong on the resurrection. The question is, well, who's wrong on the resurrection? Is it Bart, or is it those pesky evangelical apologists? I had a great time. I got to see Bart a couple weeks ago in Boston. He did a debate against Mike Licona and on who wrote the Gospels. And afterward, I got to, well, beforehand, I just said hi and we exchanged pleasantries. He, of course, remembered me from the conference 6 years ago now. And also I did a video series defending him from the attacks of apologists. But after the event, I chatted with him a little bit further. So that was nice. So it was good to see him. Okay, so let's jump into this. I see we have a couple folks watching. Josh Klein. Oh, hi, Kurt. And then we have Amateur Night. Wazam. Wazam. Is that like... You know, when I was a kid, there were these beer commercials. Was it Bud Light or Budweiser? And it was Wazab. I don't know if you remember those commercials, but maybe Amateur Night, that's what you're alluding to. Okay, so let me get up the visualizer so you can follow along with me as I get this situated. You might see the edge of my laptop there. All right, we are going to work our way through, and I will need to probably turn this little side light on if it's got power. It might not have any juice. Let's see. All right, we've got a little bit of juice. We'll see how long it lasts us. So we are getting into this here. Bart is going to make a model of history that will claim that we cannot take things from the supernatural realm. Well, I'll get into it. There's a lot I highlighted. There's a lot I wrote, more than previous chapters, because there was just a lot that I found myself disagreeing with. So the question that he starts off the chapter with is asking this: how is it that the Christian religion could become so big? Well, you might think that a growth rate of 40% every decade is huge, and therefore it must be God doing it. Well, the problem with that is that there have been other religions that have grown at such a rate. Bart mentions, for example, Mormonism. So that's on page 131. Now, what Bart thinks made Jesus distinct, and what made the Christian religion distinct, was bottom of 131. He says, now what made Jesus different from all the others teaching a similar message was the claim that he had been raised from the dead. And I'm going to, I remember, I'm a little rusty, I'll admit. It's been a couple weeks. I was in Boston, I was in Thanksgiving. I remember that I zoom in now just to make it a little easier. But is there a way of refocusing? Because the text looks a little off to me. Let's see here. Aha! Autofocus was off. So I hope this will work. Oh, not quite. Let's see here. There we go. I had to push the button. I figured it out. Gabe's told me it's good. All right. So he thinks that what made the Jesus message so different is that, well, it was claimed that he had been raised from the dead, and that's what made Jesus distinct from all these other Jewish apocalyptic preachers. All right, so he says that the issue for him is really about what the historian can claim. Now, the historian cannot claim that Jesus rose from the dead. or at least that God did such a thing, because that's not a tool in the historian's tool belt. That's my analogy. For Bart, rather, the historian could say that the disciples came to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. So that's an important distinction that he does make. And you'll see here this yellow highlight. He writes, "This is because, as a historian, I do not think we can show historically that Jesus was in fact raised from the dead." So hence the distinction between what the historian can claim about Jesus' resurrection and that it's the disciples' belief that can be historically proven. Okay? So he writes, "I argue that when it comes to miracles such as the resurrection, historical sciences simply are of no help in establishing exactly what happened." So I ask, why not? Why not? We're going to get into that because he will lay out a further case for his model of history. You see a little rhetorical flair, as is typical of Bart, on page 133, where he says, even apart from the fact that they were written, this is the Gospels, written 40 to 65 years after the fact, so on and so forth. Now, that's actually a very good timeline compared to other books of history, but Bart doesn't nuance that here, and so the implication is that this is a long time. Really, if you're a historian of antiquity, this is a very short time, but the common reader wouldn't know that. All right, now here's where I want to start off. So he's got this section, he's talking about the Gospels, and he goes on this long list of questions about the discrepancies between the resurrection narratives found in Matthew 28, Mark 16, Luke 24, and John 20 and 21. And he has this list of questions. These are not arguments, they're just sort of questions. They are questions, they're not sort of questions. I'm pretty sure every sentence in this top paragraph is a question. And the way Bart's going to use this is to have someone cast doubt, or even cast doubt on what apologists would say. So I want to tackle just one of these. I'm going to tackle the easiest one, okay, for the illustration. It is, to me, the easiest one to do away with. There are harder discrepancies to deal with in this paragraph of questions. Let me head back over to my PowerPoint. So the question is about the women at the tomb. So notice here, Bart says, was it Mary Magdalene by herself, John, or Mary along with another Mary, that's in Matthew, or Mary along with another Mary and Salome, Mark, or Mary, Joanna, and a number of other women, Luke? Well, okay, so which women and how many were at the tomb, right? That's the question, and we have a discrepancy. This is a real challenge. Let me give you 3 sentences. Oh boy, I've got to cycle through. Here we go. All right, 3 sentences. Number 1, in a church in Boston, Massachusetts, I had a conversation with Bart Ehrman. This was just less than 2 weeks ago. That's one sentence. In a church in Boston, I had a conversation with Bart Ehrman. Period. That's it. End of story. Well, but let's say in another document or letter, or I tell someone else, hey, in a church in Boston, Massachusetts, I had a conversation with Bart Ehrman, and Mike Licona was there too. Well, now here I've added Mike Licona was there too. This second sentence is in fact true. Does it make the first sentence false? No, it does not. The first sentence is true. I had a conversation with Bart Ehrman. It's also true I had a conversation with Bart Ehrman and Mike Licona was there too. These are 2 sentences that are both precisely accurate. Sentence number 3. In a church in Boston, Massachusetts, I had a conversation with Bart Ehrman. Tyson James was there, and some others. That sort of sounds like, who says the others? Luke, Mary, Joanna, and a number of other women, right? We don't have the mention of Salome, but Salome could be included in that other women description from Luke. In the same way that sentence 3 has some others, well, Mike Licona from sentence 2 could be included in some others, and in fact is. There's a picture on my Facebook cover photo. Tyson took that photo of me talking to Bart and standing next to Mike. So there's even documented evidence. But all three of these sentences are correct. They are historically accurate. There is no discrepancy between them. There is no contradiction. There's no issue here. There's no conflict. Nothing in these sentences would make you think that some detail is in conflict with another detail in a different sentence. So I would ask the person who is bringing this objection forth to demonstrate where is the contradiction. Where is this so challenge? There is no discrepancy here. Now, to me, this is an obvious case of an easy harmonization. Now, I'm not a huge fan of harmonization, although I think in many cases it is very welcome. I think I just caution against over-harmonizing. That's the concern that I have. So, but here's what maybe bothers me a bit. So let's see, I will come back to the historical considerations. Back to the camera, back to Ehrman's text. Here's what he has to say about the women at the tomb. The way this discrepancy is sometimes reconciled by readers who can't accept that there could be a genuine discrepancy in the text is by saying that the women actually met two angels at the tomb. So that's the two angels. It's the same principle. There was one angel, there was a man. Okay, well, these are not mutually exclusive ideas with regard to the angels. It's the same concept that there really is no logical contradiction. So where's the issue? Now, there is one discrepancy that is more difficult in Bart's list, and I won't get into it right now. It takes a little bit more time to develop and to explore, but the question is about the location of the post-mortem appearances to the disciples between Matthew and Luke. Matthew's is Galilee, and Luke's is in Jerusalem. So that is the hardest one of the resurrection alleged discrepancies. All right, now I highlighted this one sort of small statement by Bart in the book of Acts, written by the same author as the book of Luke. Why did I highlight this? Well, when I was reading this, so Bart says that it's the same person that wrote Luke as the person that wrote Acts. The reason why I highlighted this is because I have found that Bart will provide evidence, selective evidence for his model, and then sort of inconveniently dismiss away or theorize out as later additions or theological innovations added into the story, right? These are historically unreliable. So I highlighted this phrase because I thought, why? Why would someone like Bart even care to admit that it's the same author? Why not a copycat? Why not a later person who wanted to sound like it was the author of Luke, if you think Luke was written before Acts? Or maybe Acts was written first and Luke is the copycat, right? We could create theories and then selectively provide evidence to support that theory, but not make sense of the whole collection of the data. This is a problem I have with some of the models in biblical scholarship that will conveniently leave out the relevant details instead of a theory that makes sense of all of the data. So this would be explanatory scope in historiography. The scope that is that the theory would best explain all of the data points. And we're going to get into that a little later as well. So why? What's in it for him to admit that it's the same author? Okay, we will continue to move along. Oh, so then he goes from the Gospels to looking at the writings of the Apostle Paul. And he gives an interesting take on 1 Corinthians 15. Now, 1 Corinthians 15 includes this ancient creed. And I won't here go into all of that. although Bart does describe some of it, but there's a lot. I was genuinely surprised at some of the ground granted by Bart on this. And I haven't studied him well enough to know meticulously what he believes about this pre-Pauline creed. What is the pre-Pauline creed? Well, he quotes here this passage that he thinks Paul has added to. For I handed over to you among the most important things what I also had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, many of whom survive until now, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared even to me, as to one untimely born. So that's the passage in question. And Bart, the ground that he grants is in terms of timeline, that he does think this is a pretty early creed. Just how early, I'm not certain, but he does place it before 50 AD. So here he describes this. It's in green. If you remember my color-coded system, green indicates, hey, I like this, I learned something new. There is evidence in the passage itself that it or part of it is pre-Pauline, and it is possible to determine just which parts were the original formulation. As we will see more fully in chapter 6, there are a number of pre-literary traditions in Paul's writings and in the book of Acts, that is, quotations of statements of faith, poems, possibly even hymns that were in circulation before being cited in our surviving literary texts. So, for example, Paul will mention a phrase, this is a good and useful saying. Well, that saying predates Paul's letter. This creed, Paul says he passed on to the Corinthian church. Well, if he passed on to the Corinthian church, then he did so before he wrote the letter. So it was probably when he founded the church, was church planting, and he must have received it before he church planted. So you can see how the timeline goes closer and closer to the alleged resurrection appearances of Jesus. So all of this becomes interesting for those that really want to get deep into the weeds on the timeline. But on page 139, Bart simplifies this creed. He thinks in actual form it's shorter, and that Paul has added a few phrases to it. Nevertheless, he thinks in its original form, then the creed would have read like this. I would have preferred if Bart would have nuanced his position a little more closely and just said something like, the creed might have read like this, or even probably. But instead, it's more assertive. The creed would have read, So that's just me, maybe. All right, so here's in simplified form. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and he was buried. Christ was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas. That's Peter. So it's much shorter. It doesn't include the 500. It doesn't include Paul or James. So, nevertheless, Bart grants it's a powerful, concise, and cleverly constructed creedal statement. So, why is this important? He writes, if this reconstruction of the original form of this statement is correct, several interesting and important observations can be made. So, you're going to see here why Bart's splicing up of the creed is important to his later case about, say, the empty tomb. First, if it is right that the second statement of each section is a theological interpretation of the statement of fact that precedes it, then the idea that Jesus was raised on the third day is not necessarily a historical recollection of when the resurrection happened, but a theological claim of significance. On the next page, he talks about it's like a in a kind of symbolic 3 days, like in Jonah. So now all of a sudden 3 days is just not literal, but it's symbolic. There's some other theological value to it, like 40 days or 7, right? 3. Ooh. So Another point of note, the women go to the tomb on the third day, and they find it empty. But none of the Gospels indicates that Jesus arose that morning before the women showed up. He could just as well have arisen the day before, or even the day before that, just an hour, say, after he had been buried. The Gospels simply don't say. Now, it's true that the Gospels don't simply say, but one could also perform a timeline analysis. You can look at other relevant facts within the Gospels themselves to make a deduction as to when you think it was probable that Jesus was resurrected. Now, this would depend on a certain assumption that 3 days is 3 days, and you can perform that timeline analysis. Okay, now we're going to get into the good stuff. So, here we're going to be getting more into methodology. Bottom of 142, he raises the point that Paul doesn't mention an empty tomb anywhere in his writings. So, for many years, scholars have considered it highly significant that Paul, our earliest quote-unquote witness to the resurrection, says nothing about the discovery of an empty tomb. Our earliest account of Jesus' resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5, discusses the appearances without mentioning an empty tomb, while our earliest gospel, Mark, narrates the discovery of the empty tomb without discussing any of the appearances. Now, this is what's called an argument from silence. So, simply because Paul doesn't explicitly mention an empty tomb doesn't mean that Paul didn't believe in the empty tomb. If Paul believed in a physical resurrection of Jesus, then necessarily it is the case that the tomb was empty. If Jesus's body physically rose from the dead, then necessarily the tomb would be empty. So, again, the assumption there is that it's the same body. Now, it might be remade new, in the sense of taking old wineskin and making it new again, repurposing material parts. It's logically possible that God gave Jesus a physically new body, but that doesn't seem to be the claim of what was being made by Paul or the later disciples. Now, Paul, again, learned his material from the apostles. So Paul, in one sense, is not our first source. Paul had earlier sources that he depended upon. So take Galatians chapter 1. But just because Paul doesn't mention the empty tomb doesn't mean he didn't believe it. And that's the implication Bart wants you to come away with here, that the empty tomb is a later development in the Christian teaching. That's certainly what's being implied here. So, he says this has led some scholars, this was a rich paragraph here. This has led some scholars, such as New Testament expert Daniel Smith, to suggest that these two sets of tradition, the empty tomb and the appearances of Jesus after his deathbed, probably originated independently of one another and were put together as a single tradition only later. For example, in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Independent traditions of physical resurrection and empty tomb. Again, if Jesus is physically resurrected, it's necessarily the case that the tomb is empty. So why would we think that if they are independently, then they're later smashed together? I just don't get it, folks. This is again where some of these theories, they are questionable. We'll put it that way. So ultimately, he thinks, and I put it here, he says, you can't prove or disprove the resurrection as a historian, because ultimately belief or unbelief in Jesus' resurrection is a matter of faith, not of historical knowledge. Well, this is a categorical error regarding faith. It's also a false dichotomy. You've got two fallacies here. It's a false dichotomy that it's one or the other. It's faith or historical knowledge. It could be both. Those are not mutually exclusive ideas. It's not that faith is opposed to and cannot work with historical knowledge. But it's also a categorical error because what is faith? Faith is not irrational belief. Faith is not belief without evidence. Faith is about putting your trust that Jesus is, in fact, Lord of the universe, that he is King of kings and Lord of lords. That is what faith is about. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and that God raised him from the dead, then you will be saved. So faith is not about, again, irrationality of knowledge. It's not about blind faith. I mean, because then the word faith is just redundant because it's already blind. So, so this idea of what faith is, Bart does not in any way bring in fuller detail to explain to us. So I think he's making a categorical error about what is faith in this case. I think it is harmonious and synthetic and synergistic for historical knowledge and faith to work together in absolute harmony, and that we can use the tools of history to come to the conclusion that God raised Jesus from the dead in the first century. Let's get more into the methodology. All right. So let's see here. Where were we leaving off here? Yes. Okay, he's going to get into the weeds about historical methodology here. So I want to read probably these next 4 pages with you to explain my comments and highlights, because this was a critical portion where I just strongly disagreed with him on the historian and what the historian can and cannot believe. So he writes, a source who provides, so what's a valuable source to a historian? A source who provides disinterested, off-the-cuff comments about a person or event is better than a source who makes interested claims about a person or event in order to score ideologically driven point. Yes, this is generally true, but I also want to caution on this. Maybe we need to put a modifier, because anybody who writes a work is ideologically driven. There is a purpose why someone is writing, and so they have a bias. And there are good biases and there are bad biases. And so this idea of pitting against objectivity against bias, I think he might be putting too much weight on, because we can have, for example, historically reliable biographies of adherents of a teacher, and we can still come to believe that the facts of what they're talking about happened. It's not because, they were just or merely or simply ideologically driven, and that's why they wrote what they wrote. They can still be historically accurate. Okay. This next paragraph was fun. So he writes, these then are among the kinds of presuppositions that historians tend to share. On the other hand, some presuppositions are decidedly not at all appropriate for historians who want to establish what happened in the past. It is not appropriate, for example, for a historian to presuppose her conclusions. I agree with him there. And to try to locate only the evidence that supports those presupposed conclusions. The investigation needs to be conducted without prejudice as to its outcome, simply to see what really happened. Similarly, it's not appropriate for a historian to treat evidence as irrelevant when it does not happen to be convenient to his personal views. And I wrote, on the inside bit there, quote unquote, Son of Man. You may recall several weeks back, I think it was chapter 2, I was dealing with Bart's model of the Son of Man in Mark's gospel account, because I surveyed the times that Son of Man was used, stated by Jesus, and saw that Bart only had selected a handful of instances and conveniently ignored, i.e. literally did not mention all these several other cases when Jesus had used these. Now, in my mind, I remember I was theorizing, what would Bart say? Well, he might say something like, those cases are when the the evangelist later theologized or retroactively looked back and thought of Jesus as the Son of Man. It wasn't Jesus himself, because according to Bart, Jesus did not think of himself as the Son of Man. So that's one of those situations where you have a selective set of data you're using to support your model, conveniently ignoring the other set of data, and then coming up with a new theory of the evangelist, the writer, the author, theologizing it back into the story, the account. So there's this loose and fastness with the data, and you see how even Bart commits this. He provides this method, but yet I think Bart's committed that. He continues, moreover, and here is where the rubber meets the road, and he's right here. It's not appropriate for, he's right insofar as this is where the rubber meets the road. He says, it's not appropriate for a historian to presuppose a perspective or worldview that is not generally held. Thumbs down on this. Why is this? Appeal to majority, argumentum ad populum, and also self-defeating. Why? Well, argumentum ad populum is an argument from what's popular. So this is, again, this idea that, well, just because, what do historians generally hold? Well, you can't believe that because historians don't generally hold that. This is not a good argument. It is also self-defeating because the beliefs Bart holds regarding history were not formally of the beliefs of the consensus. The consensus has changed and shifted over the decades and the centuries, not just regarding conclusions, but methodology itself. So for Bart to say that historians should only believe what historians have generally held, that's just false. We want to have good arguments. We want to have good presuppositions. And we need to look at and evaluate what those are in those cases. We simply shouldn't dismiss someone's conclusion or someone's presupposition simply because it's not what historians have held historically. The tides shift and change. So an argument like this doesn't work. It's a poor argument that, well, the times change, and so you can't think that. It's just very unpersuaded by it. And yet he brings it up a few times. Okay, let's get into Mormonism. On page 147, he continues his historical considerations. This is also true of all religions and theological beliefs that a historian happens to have. These beliefs cannot determine the outcome of a historical investigation because they are not generally shared. There it is again, this concept, argumentum ad populum. This means that a historian cannot establish that the angel Moroni made revelations to Joseph Smith, as in the Mormon tradition. Why not? Why can't a historian make such an investigation? Bart's not saying we can explore this historically and come to a conclusion. He's saying the historian can't even do it. The historian can't even perform the analysis. My question is, why not? Why can we not use the tools of history and come to a conclusion regarding what Joseph Smith claimed happened in a forest so long ago relative to where we are in America in the 21st century? I think the historian can make such a claim. And in this particular case, I would say Joseph was lying. And, I think Bart thinks that as well. He would say Joseph was lying. And now he might have to say, well, but I can't as a historian say that. No, I think you can. You can use the tools of history and come to such a conclusion. He writes, such views presuppose that angels exist, that Moroni is one of them, and that Joseph Smith was particularly chosen to receive a revelation from on high. Such views presuppose. Now I wrote, no, it could be a conclusion. You might perform a historical investigation and you might conclude that, hey, an angel exists. It could be a sub-premise in a larger argument. So it wouldn't be this presupposition that you carry into a conversation or in historical investigation. He says these are theological beliefs. They are not based on historical evidence. Again, what if you came to the conclusion that angels do in fact exist? Then you might think that there is evidence, historical evidence, that angels exist. So what we have here, I think, is Bart's philosophical presuppositions adversely, I would argue, affecting his historical methodology. So, he talks more about these different worldviews, says historical evidence has to be open to examination by everyone of every religious belief. I agree, and I think it is. Bart doesn't think it is. But the way he phrased that, I found myself agreeing because I think it is open to everybody. All right, again, you get this idea of a philosophical presupposition dismissing, a presuppositional dismissing of what's possible in the universe. Why could it not be that the supernatural realm intervene in the natural realm and we can trace when that happens? So we'll get into that in a moment. Actually on the very next page, 148, yes. He has these two propositions. The supernatural explanation, on the other hand, cannot be appealed to as a historical response because, one, historians have no access to the supernatural realm, and two, it requires a set of theological beliefs that are not generally held by all historians doing this kind of investigation. Well, back to my PowerPoint. Here's the problem I have with that. Okay, Proposition 1, historians have no access to the supernatural realm is his claim. This is a philosophical presupposition. It's a philosophical presupposition that historians have no access to the supernatural realm. How does Bart know that the supernatural has not entered into the natural realm? Now, I very much think it's likely that at this point, Ehrman would perform a David Hume type of argument, which is just circular reasoning, that there's no evidence of the supernatural because you can't have evidence of the supernatural. And so there's just this circular reasoning that occurs because of the philosophical presuppositions affecting the methodology. Also on 148, you see this idea in Proposition 2 of the argumentum ad populum, quote, not generally held by all historians. That's the second proposition is, it requires a set of theological beliefs that are not generally held by all historians doing this kind of investigation. This, again, is a poor argument. It's logically fallacious. So his two core objections to the supernatural idea, just it doesn't work. And so we are going to find ourselves already diverting from his whatever his conclusions will be, because he's not even open to it. As a historian, I think he should be open and willing to consider a range of hypotheses. What he's doing, however, is he's dismissing their mere possibility. And I think that's unfortunate. What else can we say here? On 149, and I'll have to go back to my camera, but let's look at this slide first. Bart's going to talk about the empty tomb. He quickly transitions to talking about the empty tomb because there's a perfectly sensible solution to this. He writes, perfectly sensible other solutions as to why a once occupied tomb may have become empty. Now that's true. There might be a perfectly sensible alternative solution. However, one sensible solution for a singular data point does not explain the collection of data points. That's the problem I have here. So let's go back to the camera so you can see what he says on this. So, the historian has no access to this supernatural-like information, and that conclusion requires a set of theological presuppositions that not all historians share. Again, argumentum ad populum. Moreover, it is possible to come up with perfectly sensible other solutions as to why a once occupied tomb may have become empty. Someone stole the body, someone innocently decided to move the body to another tomb. The whole story was in fact a legend. That is, the burial and the discovery of an empty tomb were tales that later Christians invented to persuade others that the resurrection indeed happened. A few questions for Bart. These are alternative hypotheses that explain the empty tomb phenomenon. What explains the phenomenon that, say, led Paul to believe that Jesus was physically resurrected, or James, the brother of Jesus, or that Jesus was the Son of God, or so on and so forth? What led to this idea that Jesus appeared to Peter? If the empty tomb is a later development because of some other theory like the body was stolen, how would that lead Peter to come and believe that the guy that was his teacher was actually resurrected? Now, I've had teachers that have died, and let's suppose hypothetically that I go to visit their grave and it's an empty grave. Would that lead me to think that they're resurrected bodily? No, it wouldn't. So, as I mentioned in my slide, one perfectly sensible alternative solution might describe one data point, but the theory has to provide a solution, a sensible solution, to the collection of the data points. That's the issue I have here with this idea. We could come up with what about this, or what about that, or maybe this, or maybe that. You have to come up with a what about for all of the data points. You can't do it individually. They are together. It's a collective group. It's like an algebraic formula. You can get to probability theory and actually calculate this out. And this formula, you have all these variables, and the variables are the different data points, historical facts, as some of my friends might say, the bedrock of historical facts. And you need to come up with a theory that makes sense of all of them. And so if your theory only makes sense of one of those variables, or gives a lot of good weight to that one, but it fails on historical fact 2, 3, and 6, then it's not a good theory. It's not a good proposal, because you're failing to consider all these other historical facts. So I don't see how an empty tomb explains the disciples' belief. Now you might think, well, yeah, they saw an empty tomb, he's resurrected. No. Why wouldn't they have just thought, oh, the body was stolen? The body was stolen. That's a much more plausible, sensible thing to believe if you were the disciples. So what would lead the 12 disciples to come believe that their teacher had been physically resurrected? That's something Bart doesn't do here. All right, we have Stragata, who's written a few comments on the live chat. Let's see here. It's like to set aside all laws of physics. That's simply not possible. The story of the empty tomb is pretty different in all Gospels. What version is the correct one? Well, you missed our earlier commentary, Stragata, on the resurrection narrative alleged discrepancies. So you might have to provide a specific about that. But as I had mentioned earlier, I was in Boston a week and a half ago, and I had a conversation with Bart Ehrman. I really did. I had a conversation with Bart Ehrman at the debate where he was debating the subject matter of who wrote the Gospels. Now, it's also true that when I was in Boston, I had a discussion with Bart Ehrman, and Mike Licona was there as well. That is also true. Now, I didn't mention Mike in the first sentence. I did in the second. Both propositions are true. The third sentence was that I was in Boston. I had a conversation with Bart Ehrman, and Tyson James was there, and some others. Now, when I say some others, that could include other people, for example, like Mike Licona. There's nothing between these three sentences that is logically contradictory. All three sentences are, in fact, actually and precisely true. In the same way, when the gospel narratives might selectively describe certain events that happened, it doesn't mean they're contradictory. In the same way that the way I just described my experience in Boston a week and a half ago might have different details, but they're not contradictory. So I'm not saying the resurrection narratives are immune from difficulties. I've already mentioned there's one more difficult one that apologists have to deal with, and I've read different proposals on it. But nevertheless, this idea of a simplistic dismissal of the resurrection narratives, it doesn't pass your basic logic class that freshmen in college would have to take. Okay, so that's really what I had prepared. Let me see here if I had anything else. On page 149 for Bart, again, it's this idea, these philosophical presuppositions impacting his historical methodology. He writes, so too the historian can look into the question of whether the disciples really had visions of Jesus after his death. People have visions all the time. Sometimes they see things that are there. Sometimes they see things that are not there. I'll discuss this more fully in the next chapter. What historians cannot conclude, however, as historians, is that the disciples had visions of Jesus after he was really, actually dead, and that it was because Jesus really actually appeared to them alive after God had raised him from the dead. And I would say again, why not? Why can we not conclude that? I think that should be open to investigation by the historian, and that it's the philosophical, it's the naturalistic philosophical assumptions Bart is carrying in to historical methodology. And Bart's best argument is fallacious. He says, because that's just not what historians generally hold. That is argumentum ad populum, and we should therefore dismiss the historical methodology. Okay, we have Strigata still carrying on here. Was the stone in place or not? Who was first? Where did the people go and tell? Hey, Strigata, you should read this chapter alongside with me. These are the sorts of questions that Bart has asked. I will be happy to address that. If you'd like, we can do that in next week's episode, since we are running short on time. I'll tell you what, though, since I try to be a man of my word, I'm going to screenshot your questions, and then we will deal with those next week. I did want to get around to, before I close, a question from one of our listeners. Randall enjoys watching our program, and I want to pull it up on my screen here. You might see my Facebook account here. Okay, so here is the comment here. And I know I've been critiquing Bart, and here Randall has a question about Bart. So Randall writes this. He says, Kurt Jarris, amazing scholar. Thank you. Bart E. says in a recent email, this is Bart Ehrman, no doubt, that he's referring to, hundreds of surviving manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark differ from one another, ranging from simple mistakes to intentional theological changes. We have hundreds of manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, and no two are exactly the same, from spelling errors to deliberate theologically driven changes. Each scribe put their own mark on the Gospel. Randall writes, I know where Michael Lacona would go with this, showing exaggerations. Like the Bible is Frankenstein book. What is your thoughts? You have any videos from your series on Bart Ehrman? So, Randall, I will go ahead and just answer you here on the podcast. Believe it or not, I think that what Bart is saying here, now I'm not a textual critical scholar, but Bart is correct. Now, where are these cases of theologically motivated changes? I'm not persuaded that these occur as frequently as Bart claims, but I do think that it has happened. And sometimes it's well intended by the copyist when that theological change occurs. It's not a maliciously changed manuscript. They likely think the version they got was in error, and so they were attempting to fix it. Now, they might not have fixed it. They might have made it worse. But that's just the copyist. We're talking about the manuscript tradition. So, with regard to the manuscript tradition and all these copies that we have out there, yes, there are a lot of differences between them. And in one respect, no copy is alike. Well, that's because people's handwriting was different. So if you wanted to be sort of pedantic about it, Bart is correct. Now, maybe that's not the answer that you're expecting from me, but I think the way it's worded, what Bart wrote in a recent email, I would find myself agreeing with. Now, if you're looking for more resources, I would encourage you to rewatch that series I did. It was called Misquoting Ehrman, because I do get into some of the weeds on the manuscript tradition, what apologists have said about Bart, and how I think he was treated unfairly. So I'm trying my best to call the shots as I see them, call the fouls where I see them, and that's one of the things I enjoy doing. I want there to be fair dialogue between people who have disagreements, whether that's within Christianity or whether it's between Christians and non-Christians. As apologists, we need to, apologetics is about the defense of the Christian worldview. Our job, lowercase a apologist, is to defend the truth. And we need to accurately describe our opponents. Otherwise, we're not defending the truth of what they believe. So we have to defend the truth of what our opponents believe before we can assess and evaluate whether their arguments are sound. Now, as I've worked through the start here of chapter 4 in Bart's book, I'd like to think I haven't misunderstood his arguments. That's step one, right? If I've misunderstood him in some way, well, then the argument I present is a straw man. So I want to understand him first. I want to understand him accurately first, and then we can critique the arguments. And I hope that I've done so in a way that will help the reader of Bart's book come to realize, oh, that's actually not a good argument. You can't just say, well, we dismiss that because historians don't think that, and haven't. Because historians have changed their minds over the decades and the centuries about what historians can and cannot believe. And Bart's own beliefs about history and historical methodology were at one point not part of the consensus. So if we were to employ that argument he has, his own beliefs today would have been dismissed. The reason why I say that is because that's why it's self-defeating, the argument. Argumentum ad populum is a poor argument. But that's the main argument he has against the supernatural, mixing with some Humean stuff about there's no evidence of the supernatural, and therefore, yeah. So I just don't think that Bart's historical method was good in this chapter. But what he said there in the email that you cite, Randall, I don't think we should take too much stake with. He's talking about the manuscript tradition. And that doesn't say much about what the originals said. And Bart believes we can reconstruct the originals within something like 99% confidence. So, what's the issue? I'm glad that Bart has been able to reach many people. I'm a little sad that the rhetorical flair that he sometimes brings to the table leads people in the wrong direction. And so that's why I enjoy engaging with his material and trying to fairly understand him. I don't want to be accused of misunderstanding him. There was a fun, I'll close on this. At the debate, there was was it Cross-X or Q&A? Someone, I think, had asked Mike a question about what Bart believed, and Mike said, well, Bart believes X, Y, and Z, and then Bart said, well, you're attacking, my model, and Mike very calmly said, well, is anything I said incorrect? And Bart had to think about it for a second and said, no. It was just this, there was a lot of laughter. It was a good time. That must have been, I don't know, the 10th debate between those guys. They've gone at it for quite a while. Okay, well, so Randall, that might not have been the answer you've been looking for, but again, pursue truth and keep going at it. I'm glad you're interested in these sorts of things. And, think about the implications for what's being proposed. How do I get to my last slide here? There we go. Yes, think about the implications for what's being proposed, because maybe the implications aren't so bad after all. So from Bart's email, so what? So what if about the manuscript tradition and the changes if Bart still says at the end of the day we've got 99% confidence, what has changed about our strong understanding of what the Gospels and the New Testament teach? We can be strongly confident with 99% at that rate. So, all right. Well, that does it for the show today. I am grateful for the continued support of our patrons. Our patrons are individuals such as yourself who have decided to partner alongside Veracity Hill and with me to continue bringing these thoughtful analyses, whether that's going deep into the weeds of a book, whether that's teaching on models of salvation, whether that's talking about the canon of Scripture or Protestant Catholic dialogues. I'm grateful for everyone who has partnered alongside with us. If you want to become a partner, you can go to veracityhill.com/donate and start your partnership today. Thank you for your generous consideration of partnering with me. I'm also grateful for the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Apologetics 315, and Rethinking Hell. I want to thank the team at Defenders Media, without whom I could not have done this. It takes a nonprofit company to be putting out the materials that we are at Veracity Hill. That's a joke, by the way, on the whole "it takes a village to raise a child" sort of thing. It takes a nonprofit company to help me put out as many videos and resources as we do at Veracity Hill. So thank you to Gabe and Mark and Kyle and Dante and Beth, Sophia and Kevin, Peter, and even sometimes Chris. I'm really grateful for how they've been of benefit to this overall ministry as well. They do other things as well, not just for Veracity Hill, but helping out other ministries as well. It really is a blessing to come into work every day and to work with these people. Last but certainly not least, I want to thank you for watching or for listening in as we've been striving for truth on the resurrection of Jesus.
This has been Veracity Hill, a viewer and listener supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.